Welcome back to the Docker file options section of the Getting Started with Docker course. In this lesson, we're going to be covering volume. Now, this is a section where it took me a long time to figure out exactly what was going on here. So let's walk through what volume is. Let's start with going to the documentation, scrolling down to find volume. And it's a very, very simple entry. So you have this volume / my vol. So performant in order to keep them so they're always the same no matter what, we don't have persistent storage internally. It's volatile. And so if you were to destroy the image and bring it back up, then that data be gone. And we don't keep containers active and move the actual container. We move the images around and restart a new container. And so the idea of storing data in your container is not a great idea. And so, for example, what if you ran SQL Server inside of your container? Well, you can do that, but you don't want to have your data stored inside that container. You want the data somewhere else. In this case, you would store it in a volume, which then would persist even after the container gets destroyed. So in simple terms, that seems to make sense. But here's where it goes off the rails just a little bit. This my vol is a folder inside your container. And that's cool. But where is it locally on your actual machine? Well, they don't really tell you, and you don't specify here. In fact, you can't specify here. You can only tell it the path inside your container. So what happens is that Docker will create what's called an anonymous volume and attach it on your machine. And usually it's in a special Docker folder. And you can find out where that is with some digging, but the reality is it's not just, you're not sharing out your C drive, C/temp, that's my vol. That's not what you're doing here. Now, there is a command to do that when you do Docker run, but not inside the Docker file. And here's the reason why. Because if we started putting paths for our local machine inside this Docker file, then what would happen is that it would have to be an absolute path, and that path would have to exist on every machine that this Docker file runs on. And that's not ideal, because we don't know for sure that path will exist everywhere. So it makes the Docker file more fragile. And so the choice was made to not allow you to specify the local path for your volume. So that's a quirk, okay? The other thing is this is treated, if you look at it internally to the system, Now on Windows, there's a couple of other things to note. Either it has to be a non-existing or empty directory, so this myvol can't exist, or you have to be using a drive other than the C drive. So that's the quirk there, in that you can't say C:/Windows because that already exists. But if you said D:/temp and dtemp already existed, not a problem because it's not the C drive. So just note that. Also note that anything that is already in that location will get copied over to your machine. That can be pretty time consuming if there's already big things in there. So that being said, all we need to do is say volume, and then in our case, we could actually make this htdocs location. We could make that into a volume. And now all of a sudden, it's going to copy those files over that are already there, and it's going to now make that a volume on our machine, which means in theory, even with the machine, the container off, we could go into and find where this is located, and we can make a modification to the file, start the container back up, and that modification would be there. So there is some benefits there. Now, this is the pathing for a Linux container. For Windows, it's a bit different. Now notice this is Windows containers, not on Windows. Okay, so I'm on Windows currently. I'm running Docker on Windows, but I'm using Linux. So Docker is using Linux. And so I'm calling Linux commands and I'm using Linux images. However, if I was using a Windows image and I was using Docker for Windows with the Windows images, then for the path, I would have to say C:/this/ like so. So it's a little bit different in the formatting. So you use the other slash, and that temp cannot exist when I create this volume, because otherwise it's on the C drive, and it's a C drive, and it's a non-existent or empty directory. It's not non-existent or empty if it has something in it. Okay, but that's the syntax if you're using Windows containers. But note you can't do this when you are using a Linux container and using Docker for Linux. All right, so let's undo that because we don't want the Windows version since we're using Linux. And you can switch these around, what you're using on Windows. You just right-click on the icon and say, hey, I want to use it for Windows now. The only trick there is if you're currently running Linux containers, you can't manage them until you switch back to Linux. You can still run them, but you can't manage them until they I've eliminated the things that are not simple, but volume, and then specify the location that will become a folder on the container that will then be shared locally with your machine. So your machine will host that volume. That way, any changes that are made to that volume get put on your machine, which then persists outside of the lifespan of a container. You can, and we'll get into it with the with some of the runtime flags, or some of the flags we go through later, but you can have more than one container point to the same location on your machine. So that can be really helpful when you are having different machines, like maybe you have two different versions of SQL Server, two different containers that use SQL Server, and you take one down, you bring a new one up with new changes, but you point to the same data location. That can be very helpful. Now again, this does not specify where on your local machine this folder lives. We'll get to that when we get to the Docker run commands, where you actually get to see how we can specify a location on our machine as a volume. So we'll get to that. But for now, in the Docker file, this is what we have access to, which is just a volume on the container side. Okay, so that's volumes. So you got one more thing we're going to cover in the Docker file before we're done with this section. So come on back for that video.